Awesome. We get to say those magical words that everybody longs to say, which is, and we're live.
Yeah.
So, Erick, you're here with me, and this is incredible because I don't know a ton about you, and I'm going to find out everything I can while other people watch us through the internet, which is weird.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. I really appreciate your charity and inviting me on. I think some of our we developed a text conversation some weeks ago, but I kind of knew that this was not going to be something where we could stay at a text, you
Yeah.
know, conversation level. I think it takes a real live audio discussion because this is such big topics and they're life impacting and there's so much detail to give. It's just not meant for fingers.
Yeah. Not meant for fingers is good. Um, do you get a lot of Orthodox people that reach out to you to be on their shows and stuff?
Oh, that's a good question. So, Eastern Orthodox, um, I can't think of an Eastern Orthodox YouTube channel that had me on off the top of my head. I know I had Father Josiah Trenum on
Hmm.
Reason in Theology, which, by the way, a lot of people don't realize this, but Reason in Theology, I was there from Ground Zero, episode one,
Yeah.
but and some people I mean, moralistic or practically speaking, consider me a co-founder, but we didn't really have any agreement on, this was half mine, half his. It was always Michael Lofton's channel. So I just kind of had fun tagging along for a while.
Yeah.
So I sometimes I'll refer to having people on the show. It makes it sound like it was my show. Actually, it wasn't. I guess I was just a very repetitive uh, visitor back.
Yeah.
But we had Father Josiah Trenum on, and that was great. I really like Father Josiah, and he extended an invitation to me if I ever made my way to California to have lunch with him. I'm pretty sure I could have, you know, struck up a relationship there. There's been some other good friends of mine. So Dr. Ed Sichensky, for example, he's over at in Pennsylvania. Uh, we've developed a friendship online, and he's actually coming back from the IOTA conference in Greece. Um,
Oh yeah.
and he let me know that he was reading my papacy book on the plane there. So I felt very humbled that one of my you know Byzantinist heroes was reading my own book. 10 years ago, I would have never supposed that would have happened.
Yeah.
But I plan to have him on my show, sooner or
Yeah.
later. But it seems as though a lot of Eastern Orthodox YouTube channels that don't know me, they're not familiar with me. Um, they see me as bad news bear. So,
Why?
well, you know, um, I guess it really got out there the most when I started writing articles about the papacy and in the first millennium, and those started to get a lot of traction on the internet, and it hit high gear when
Hmm.
on Reason and Theology, uh, we had an individual who, for a couple of years before, he had been calling me out on YouTube. Jay Dyer, I'm sure you've heard of him. Uh,
Sure have.
yeah, well, people would send me links with him, saying, "Hey, there's a guy out there. His name is Erick Ybarra. Um, why doesn't he debate? Men debate. Females don't." Um,
Oh, jeez.
there's a quite a females do like to debate. But anyway, that's just this something to set aside. But I always thought that was very strange. It was very combative. But
Yeah.
one day we decided we read one of his articles that he wrote, and we decided to do a public response to it.
Hmm.
And we hardly mentioned his name. Hardly, didn't mention anything about him. But some Orthodox people they heard about the stream that was live, and they sent it to him. And I mean, he could have been Forrest Gump on with his fingers quickly typing in the link to our stream, and then he was on the live chat saying, "Let me in. I want to get in there and talk with Eric and this and that." And at that point, we're like, "Wow, he really wants to talk." And we didn't know what to do. Up to that point, we were kind of hesitant to even have him on the show, but
Sure.
we said, you know what, let's give it a shot. I mean, we've got all these people here who want to see it. So he came on the show. It was not planned. It was just one of these things that just happened out of nowhere. And we spent like 2.5 hours going back and forth on. Originally, the issue was the papacy, but it got, it went in all kinds of directions. And so after that was done, uh, he continued to go after me in
Yeah.
quite significant ways. And I remember one stream that he did. He said that they had a plan. They had some sort of a strategic plan in mind for how to deal with Ibarra. And that's when the community called Ubi Petrus came out.
Hmm.
A lot of people didn't realize that was a group project at first. There were different people uh, that were using the account. Um, that's how it was presented to me. They presented themselves to me as a subsidiary of Jay Dyer. And so that community initially was made in order to with a singular aim in mind, to go after anything that Ibarra says in articles or in videos, and just take it apart. And so since then, like, my name went out there as basically like the Orthodox, like I'm after the Orthodox.
Yeah.
And so people have tended to see me as kind of like a hater of Eastern Orthodoxy, wanting to convert Orthodox to Catholicism. And so I think even if there was an Orthodox channel out there who wanted to have me on, they might have to deal with some pushback from
Yeah.
other Orthodox. How dare you have this guy on the show? So I
Yeah.
think that's one of the reasons why I haven't been on too many Orthodox channels.
Well, I don't know if this counts as an Orthodox channel. I mean, I'm Orthodox, but the vast majority of the audience are Catholics, and I'm just interested in this conversation and doing it well. Learning how to do it well with other people. So all that being said, you basically got introduced to the internet by a certain group of people as one thing. So here's an opportunity. You've already mentioned you have a book, you have a show, you have a lot of different experiences. Why don't you introduce yourself as the Eric that you want people to know?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So, you know, back in 2005, when I had my initial conversion to Christ, I was raised a Roman Catholic, from Miami Beach, Florida, originally. Um, and I quickly descended into atheism in high school, but I had a conversion experience at university in 2005, and I spent years as a Protestant. But then uh, just like anybody who gets involved with ministry, I was out there open air preaching. I was part of a Reformed Baptist church, so we were kind of like we saw our spiritual ancestors in the Donatists.
Okay.
So we were a very strange little community um,
Hmm.
that historically minded. We would read the church fathers, we would read the early canons, and we would kind of say, well, these things about like sacraments and the Eucharist, that's all like so. But we could eat the meat and spit out the bones, and so we tried to inculcate a early patristic consciousness with penance, asceticism, the moral rigor of community accountability,
Yeah. So
constant. Yeah,
real quick, sorry to interrupt you. Before
no.
we get too far away from it, you said, seeing your spiritual ancestors in the Donatists. Can you just unpack that and explain that
Oh
for
yeah,
people?
sorry about that. Yeah, yeah. So in the early church, you had several movements that would happen on local levels where the one guy or a group of persons would say that the sin has corrupted the church, and they would try to start something afresh. Well, the Donatists was a movement like that in North Africa, and at the end of the third century, towards the right beginning of the fourth century in the 300s, early 300s, and it was originally started by a guy named I want to say his name was Majorinus, but it was his successor Donatist or Donatus, who got famous for defending the position, and they believed that if a minister or a person in the community was a known traitor or traditores, somebody who gave up the books during persecution, somebody who pinched incense under pressure, somebody who was involved in serious public sin, like a scandal, or even if it was private, but people knew about it, on a private level, that would basically poison all the sacraments so they wouldn't be valid anymore. Baptism, Eucharist,
Mhm.
ordination, preaching, even being in the same room with some of those people could poison you. So you had to separate yourself and start a new, fresh community with a holy bishop or a holy priest that wasn't involved, wasn't entangled in the communion of people like that. So those were the early Donatists. And so the Baptist church, so that kind of sounds weird. A Baptist church would look at the Donatist church. We would look at them and say, well, we really like that the fact that they were standing up for holiness, you know,
Yeah.
and so that's in that sense we look back and said that they were like, they were there before the imperialization of Christianity with Constantine, and we were a Reformed Baptist, but we really loved the Puritans. We read a lot on the a lot of John Wesley, the Holiness movement, revivalist preachers like Paul Washer was one guy. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but he was a preacher back.
Yeah.
One of these Protestant guys. Um, Charles
He's intense.
Spurgeon. Yeah, Charles Spurgeon, Leonard Ravenhill, A.W. Tozer. Just a lot of Wesleyan holiness authors. So we were, we excommunicated a lot of people. Let's put it that way. If you were there, you were baptized. Um, After a year or so, everybody expected you to walk straight line
Yeah.
with attendance and all those things. So um, i- after a while, I started to look into the roots of Christianity, and I found out that the foundations of the Christian faith um, told me something very different than what I had been taught there. So I sort of walked the horizon, from the free church communities like where I was to Lutheranism. Spent some time as
Mhm.
a Lutheran, sitting down with Lutheran clergy, reading everything they gave me. But then I found a happy home in the high church Anglican uh, society, Anglo Catholic Church, little church called St. Albans. And there I was able to retrieve a lot of what existed in the early church: episcopate, sacraments, Eucharistic sacrifice, the Mass, penance. There's a lot there. Intercession of the saints. Um, so I was able to. I felt like I could be historical without really putting my neck out there under the guillotine of having to be Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, because
Yeah.
I kind of viewed them as too sectarian, with kind of like how Peter Kreeft described it in a lecture he gave way back in the 90s, where the original ship that took off on the day of Pentecost, by the time you get to late Byzantium and the medieval Europe Catholicism, it's just this ship with all these barnacles collected from the dirt in the
Mm.
ocean. And I didn't want to go that far, so I
Yeah.
found I found a happy home as an Anglican. Um, but as I was an Anglican, um, I continued to pray, continued to seek the Lord and His will for my life. Uh, Continued to read books. And what's funny is that the the rector at the Anglican Church and the people that were there at the Anglican Church, a lot of them were intellectuals. A lot of them were professors, Christian theologians, and I noticed they'd be carrying around books by like Aquinas, um, this Scotus. I even saw books on the Desert Fathers, Saint Maximus the Confessor, and so that piqued my interest. Who are these people? And so I started to learn about the spirituality of the first millennium, monasticism, and all these things. And I quickly learned that the ecclesial consciousness that I had as an Anglican was not historical. It actually violated the consciousness of the unanimous consensus of the fathers,
Mm.
and so that forced me to go to the fork of earlier divisions. Obviously, the first one being the Latin versus Byzantine split in the
Mhm.
11th century. 11th to 15th century, all that, the terrible, terrible, heart wrenching situations between Greeks and Latins. And then obviously before that, going all the way back to the 5th century with the Miaphysites and,
Mhm.
the Christians that followed along the lines of the Nestorian migration towards Persia and then went off to, into the Far East. Um,
Yeah.
and became highly populated Christian civilizations. um, and so I just I knew that you know the trail was longer than I thought. I thought I could stop at Canterbury, uh,
Yeah.
but I continued on and came to the fork between the Bosphorus and the Tiber. And so that's when I said, I'm going to have to make this a a lifetime study.
Yeah.
And so I eventually found enough confidence to say that I could become Catholic, but I
Mhm.
never ever took my eyes off of the Eastern Orthodox Church and its claims, um, nor the what we call the Oriental Orthodox. And so uh, I didn't want to keep this all to myself.
Mhm.
So I started to become a little bit more public with my intent for conversation. I had met some Orthodox priests, sat down with them for lunch, um, met some Orthodox people online through forums that weren't quite as engaging as something like Facebook, or Twitter. And so I decided to start a blog. I decided to write long articles on what I was seeing from the historical data, and I was looking for some dialogue with Orthodox thinkers,
Hmm.
and so that's how I started. That's how ErickYbarra.org started. You can go back to the very first article. That's what it is. It's me showing my singular interest in the Catholic and Orthodox dialogue,
Yeah.
and so, but because naturally I was, well, not naturally, because otherwise everybody would go that way, but uh it just so happens that I became increasingly more convinced of the Catholic side of the divide, and in proportion to that trajectory, I engendered some hostility from uh,
Mm.
Orthodox readers, and so I think that's where that comes from. But I've maintained very close friendships with Orthodox in real life. I can visit the Orthodox parishes around me with no problem. Uh,
Hmm.
so there was a time where, after becoming Catholic, I I was so frustrated with the things that were going on in the Catholic Church, because one can only read so much of Latin patristics and medieval scholasticism, and the Catholicism of the late or the pre-modern to postmodern period, before they start seeing what's on the ground.
Yeah.
You can only do it so much, and you actually have to start going to a Catholic parish and
Right.
and experiencing parish life, and quite the dichotomy from my research. I came across some very uh, liberal priests who were careless about the Christian faith, um, the worst homilies, the worst liturgical celebrations of our Lord that you could possibly imagine. And so that ended up making me go back to the drawing board after about a year. And at that point, what I started to do was I started to go to an Eastern Orthodox parish on Sunday mornings, and then I would go to Catholic Mass either Saturday evening or Saturday evening, and then Sunday evening, you know,
Hmm.
to fulfill my obligations, my canonical
Sure.
obligations, right? Um, and I became an Orthodox catechumen, and there was a point
Now,
where,
what, real
go ahead,
quick,
yeah.
what really drove that? Was it just a desire to say, okay, I want to study this in a more formal way while also having feet on the ground in the parish? So I'm getting the experiential and the informational? Or was it more like I'm kind of fed up with what I'm experiencing in the Catholic world and I'm looking for fresh air?
Yeah, so 90% of it was reactionary. I didn't want to be a Catholic anymore because I was upset about what I was seeing, and I wanted I was thirsty for antiquity. I was thirsty
Hmm.
for the mystical, um, and so 10% of it was that that I actually was confident that Eastern Orthodox could procure that for me, or I could find that in the Orthodox Church. So I spent a lot of time soaking in the YouTube glory of Orthodox liturgy.
Hmm. Right.
Anybody who, if you just type in Eastern Orthodox chants, Eastern Orthodox liturgies. What's interesting is the first liturgy I found on YouTube that I was just mesmerized by, and I would watch it over and over and over again. I would put it into my car while I was driving. I would watch it at night. Um, it turns out later I found out it was a Coptic liturgy.
Wow.
Yeah. But which is significant. It's significant
Yeah.
because you get a lot of the whole. I had met some Orthodox clergy, some monastics that were telling me, Eric, you're all about this like intellectual stuff, this history and the books and all this stuff. Look, just come and see and
Right.
taste and smell. Come and
Hmm.
see, taste and smell. Come and see, taste and smell. And the idea is, if you go to an Orthodox celebration, you're going to see the mystical glory of God. And so I got a whiff of that from the liturgy that I was watching on YouTube. But when I found out it was Coptic, um, you know, that kind of caused a bit of a clash, because if I went back to the this particular deacon monastic, this it was a monastic um priest, actually, at a monastery. If I would have went back to him and said, well, I didn't visit this place, but I'm definitely seeing, and I'm definitely getting the sense of this awe, but it's Coptic. I found out it was Coptic. He would say, well, you know they're in schism, and they're
Yeah.
they're in heresy. So the come, see, taste, and smell actually didn't wasn't sufficient to arbitrate within the Eastern traditions,
Hmm.
because as it turns out, you can go to a Byzantine Catholic parish, you can go to a Coptic parish, you can go to Armenian, you know, apostolic community, and see something that will kind of give you the same, feeling. Anyway, when I learned about that, that was something that was interesting to me. I said, well, I've got to be careful here, because I noticed a lot of people around me were just going Eastern Orthodox because of that. I don't need to know, I don't even need to study the
Yeah.
ins and outs of anything. I just know when I'm there and I'm chanting and I'm saying, Lord have mercy, when I'm in the zone, I know I'm in the truth. The problem I began to see with that is, I was getting that feedback from my Coptic friends, and I actually had an American friend who was a long attendee at a Coptic parish nearby. Um, and he would go from Coptic liturgy to OCA, back and forth. A couple months in the Coptic church, a couple months in the OCA. Then he ended up spending 8 years as a Coptic, and for him, he loved the Coptic, the Basilian liturgy. He loved the way that the Coptics did, and the way he described it to me was beautiful. So I knew that I could not, if I was a single guy in college, maybe I would jump into it, but I was married and I have children. So I have to be a little bit
Yeah.
more careful with where I'm going, because as it turns out, that friend of mine who was Coptic, he ended up getting into a car crash, a really
Mm.
bad car crash. Sorry, no, 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 not him. His son got into a really bad car crash, and his son, you know, was about 22 years old. He was trying to get his son to go to church, but he was just, college life, seeking things for his himself. And they were in the hospital a couple days later when he was recovering, and my friend Patrick said, "Son, what can I do? What can we do to make things a little better now that your life has been a little bit wrecked?" He said, "I want to go to church."
Mm.
And he said, "But I want to go to the Catholic Church." Now,
Mm.
I never asked Patrick why his son specified that. Could have been a girl. I don't know. But
Yeah.
eventually, Patrick ended up going into the Catholic Church, and now he's actually a catechist now, and at a
Was.
very at a Novus Ordo, at a Novus Ordo
Mm.
parish that's a little bit on the, you know drums and guitar side of things.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a far
very,
cry from the Coptic liturgy.
yeah, very, very far cry. But for some reason he's all right with it. Um, so um, when I was a catechumen, I I soaked in all the glory, and like I said, 90% of it was I wanted to get away from what I was experiencing, and a little bit of it was I thought the Orthodox was the place to go. They're much bigger than the Coptics. There seems to be a more robust theological variety. Some of the Coptic places I went to was basically like one large family of Egyptians that were all going to school for medical stuff, or
Yeah.
they were engineers. Um, and and that kind and the other thing that got to me was when Patrick left the Coptic church, they kind of understood, like he was the only American there, blonde hair, blue eyed, his skin was is like Major Payne said, like white on rice, paper plate, a snowstorm, and a glass of milk. um, he was the only white guy there, and so he tried for a long time. He tried to get them to evangelize. He wanted to set up some sort of meet and greet to get for outreach and things like that. But he did notice that they were increasingly wanting to stay Egyptian with the way they did
Mhm.
things, with the titles that they with the money, that when they put money into activities for the parish, it really was not intent on like evangelizing.
Have you
And
ever seen? There's a Coptic parish. Well, there's a movement of American Coptic Orthodox parishes, and in Washington D.C., I think it's like Saint Timothy and Saint Titus, or Saint Anthony and Saint Timothy. I can't remember. It's this American Coptic parish, and they do like the regular liturgy of Saint Basil. Then they have a break for coffee hour, and then they do a contemporary like worship service with guitars and a band, and then the priest will give like a 35-minute like evangelical style sermon, and then they go into small groups. So it's like this weird amalgamation of American church culture, like tacked on to the Coptic
that's
tradition.
interesting.
Just
I'm not aware of that specific site, but I do know that the local Coptic church, they did end up creating a charismatic counterpart, because a lot of their teens, um, once they got their own cars, they were starting to go to the charismatic churches because they felt
Mhm.
something. They really felt something, and
I
so
feel what
go
I've
ahead.
noticed is it seems to me. So I visit a local. There's a lot that we could talk about here, and I'll kind of interject this, and we'll see
Go
where it
ahead. Yeah,
goes.
yeah,
But
yeah.
so I live like 10 minutes from a Coptic parish, which I consider myself blessed for that because there's not that many in America, right? And the things that I've noticed about it, like if Eastern Orthodox were in full communion with the Oriental Orthodox, I would probably make that parish my home parish. There's
Hmm.
something about the people there are very there's something that has a charismatic bent to it already. There's a whole lot of posturing in prayer, and as someone, I came from a Pentecostal background, so that's very familiar to me. And then there's something about it that seems very childlike and folky almost because it's so much less developed than the Byzantine tradition. And when I talked to the priest there, I asked him things like, "Hey, I don't ever see anybody venerate icons. I don't ever see anybody kiss the icons." And he said, "Well, we didn't have the Seventh Council, so we didn't have the overreaction to that. And it seems like they have a much more natural place in the life of the church."
Right.
And uh, the people are extremely welcoming and friendly. I had almost the opposite experience as what your friend Patrick felt, where they were
Yeah.
very willing to kind of go about that sort of thing. But yeah, I'll pause there and just kind of let you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I started to go to the Orthodox catechumenate, and I got to be really close friends with the priest, and my wife became really close friends with his wife. Um, at at that time, though, I started to be worried about what was being taught um, in the catechumenate, and without going into any details, okay,
Sure.
one person came out and said something, and it's more on something that you would hear more or less from the left leaning side of bioethics. And when they said that positively, I looked to the priest at his dining room table, and I was expecting him to say, well, the Orthodox Church also doesn't accept that, or this and that. But he just sort of like laughed and, giggled and said that he understood, and he understood. So I was like shocked. So then I,
Sure.
went went to talk to him about it afterwards, and um my wife went to talk to the, to the Matushka, and they basically said that at this parish we don't judge. And I got a little scared from hearing that because, of course, the Bible says judge not, right? But
Sure.
it's a little bit of a red flag depending on what somebody means by that. And so I started to learn a little bit more about what had happened with the ecumenical movement in Greece going back to 1924, that explained what I had begun to see. Because when I wanted to leave the Catholic Church so that I can become part of a rigorous, conservative, ascetic, disciplinarian, traditional antique community that strictly follows the councils, the canons, the fathers, all that. And what I began to see was that, like the chanting, the incense, the liturgy, the words in the chant, all that was still there, but began to start seeing the same things that I was repelled by in the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
And so I said, well, wait a minute. I'm not going to get fooled twice now. And in the local Orthodox community here in Central Florida, I went to one of these like festivals, and the leading priest there got up on the microphone to kind of open up the ceremony, not ceremony, but open up the festival. They had lots of food, people were dancing, and he said he couldn't think of a better person to open up the convocation than his long friend. And then he introduced the bishop, the Catholic bishop of the town. So when I saw that, I was like, something's not right here. Like, I want to get away from Catholicism.
Hmm.
Why is it that, I'm coming to the Orthodox Church to kind of get away from Catholicism? Why do I see people with Pope Benedict books on their shelf at home? Why am I seeing priests who are quoting Pope Francis? Why do I see them being okay with doing things with Catholics? You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
I started to wonder if what I was supposing was going to be there was a mirage.
Interesting.
And so, online, I was able to find people who were going to say, oh, well, where are you going? And I'd tell them where I was going. Oh, yeah, well, that explains it. Back in
Right.
the 70s, this happened. And back in the 80s, this guy got involved. I said, okay, well, where do I go then? Well, you got to go here, you know. And then you go there. And then it's like, you might be driving 3 hours away from your house to go to some mobile home decked out in icons with a priest who doesn't speak English, and he's got to use his daughter to translate, and there's only a few people there. And it's like, okay, if I'm going to make this kind of sacrifice, I
Hmm.
need to be absolutely sure. If God wants me to do it, I'll do it, right? I'll go wherever you want me to go, Lord. But I, I, I turned in my resignation from the catechumenate process. I said, look, I realized that I need to look into things more. And
Hmm.
before I forfeit what is deemed my baptismal vow as a Catholic, I need to spend more time studying these things out. And so that's when I tried to learn how to cope. You know how the Orthodox say it online,
Sure.
coping. I had to learn how to cope. with the situation, because I realized that as an Orthodox, I was also going to have to learn how to cope. And I figured, well, if I'm going to have to learn how to cope in both of them, let me just stay still before I have to figure out how to cope somewhere else.
Yeah.
I might as well try to figure things out where I'm at. And that's when
So
I go
real
ahead. Yeah.
quick, where's your wife at in this process? How's she feeling, and what is she discerning, and is that causing tension between you? Can I ask that?
Yeah. So my wife was, she was also just very curious, very curious. When we came to the Catholic Church, for her, that was a big step, and she became convinced of it, um, from our conversations, from the things that she was reading, and but when we started to look into the Orthodox Church, she wasn't as on board with me. So she's going along with it, wanting to hear both sides. Um, but she didn't really voice her opposition, but I could see that she wasn't as comfortable, with what I was looking at, because I quickly got into looking into, like, the genuine Orthodox communities,
Like
the one.
true Orthodox
Yeah,
things.
like the
Yeah.
GOA and the Cyprianites, the Matthewites, the whole movements, that all those movements that were, against what they understood were the canonical violations that came out of the Archdiocese of Greece and the New Calendar, and like the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of mayhem. It could be a bit of mayhem for a woman who is not, first of all, she hasn't read a lot of church history. Is not big into theology. To throw somebody in that and say that their eternal life depends on them getting in the right place, that could be a little bit hectic, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I had to learn how to cope as a Catholic, because I figured we were going to have to learn how to cope anywhere. Um, so that's when I started to, learn how to navigate the rough waters as a Catholic, while continuing to study church history, with the question of the schism, who's right, who's wrong. It's very apparent that the Latins seem like they're the ones responsible, but let me give it another year. Let me study more, read more. And when I did that, I started to amass a library of my own composition notebooks with my own notes.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, Eric, this is all like in paper. Nobody sees this. How do you know you're right about this? And so that's when I started to write more and more. I started to write articles, very long articles, and it reached a point where I said, you know what, I need to compile this into a book. And
Yeah.
that's when the project started, with writing the papacy book, which turned out to be almost an 800-page book. Oh, there you go. um, and once I was done with that, I submitted that for publication. It took a long time for the
I'm sure.
publisher to edit that. So while they were editing it, I pumped out another book of my own on the filioque way, because that's, a, a bigger issue, historically speaking. Um,
Hmm.
so that's so I maintained very good relations with that Orthodox church that I was enrolled as a catechumen with. The people there were lovely. They, when my wife was pregnant, they came and visited us. They brought meals. um so when we left, it was a little, some of them were a little confused, especially those who, you know they were just simplistically in heart.
Yeah.
They didn't understand why I couldn't go anymore, and so it felt terrible. But the family there, the clerical family, the people there are still great people. I still sit down and have lunch from time to time with parishioners. Um, but I
That's
stayed
great.
Catholic. I stayed Catholic, and as I stayed Catholic, I started to learn more and more, and I realized that there was some wisdom in the hesitations that I gave. Um, so where I'm at today is, um, I'm only a human being,
Hmm.
and I can't say I've resolved everything. There's just no way, you know.
Sure.
Um, But I do think that if I were to be judged right now at the terrible throne of Christ, I responded to every bit of glimmer of light that he has given me.
Mhm.
And so I would throw it in, I would leave it up to him.
Yeah,
Until something shines more in a different place, I'm staying where I'm at for now, at least.
yeah. I remember my first time going through Great Lent in an Orthodox church, and you get to the Sunday of the Last Judgment, and it's the first, a good Protestant boy, I've read Matthew 25 100
Mhm.
times, but until you hear it chanted in the center of the church, of here are the criteria for judgment, and it was almost scandalous to me that there was no like theological propositions in that. There was nothing about ecclesiology. There was nothing about uh, any of that stuff. Now, not to say that that's unimportant or that that's not part of it, but I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was in prison and you visited me. I think that should give everyone hope rather than fear that like it's going to be okay. I think I've heard you say either on Matt's channel or other places, or maybe you've said this directly to me, like Christ didn't die on a cross and resurrect to catch you on a technicality.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be quite the contradiction. For somebody to um the scripture says in Romans chapter 5 that um it's in Paul's letter to Romans and also St. John the evangelist, his first epistle. Paul says God demonstrates his love to us in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. And then in First John, we know love by this, that he sent his son into the world to be the expiation for our sins. So the way we comprehend God's first move to us is in this horrific bloody death, right? So that you got to let that speak to you.
Mm.
You know, you don't come full circle with that event until you realize you were on his mind. If you can't get there, you're not making full circle with Christianity. You've got to get there where you and all of your, you got to set your pride aside and just turn yourself into a baby and recognize that he went that far for you. And when you soak that in, it would, to come into these forums where, especially like with the non-canonical Orthodox or the Sedevacantists, where they're
Yeah,
like, it's if you're not abiding by this canon, if you're not doing this, if you're not fasting this much, if you're not doing this, then you know God is God turns into this assassin. It's like he's out for you. He's making sure that if there's an opportunity to kill you,
yeah,
spiritually, it's going to happen. And that's just a contradiction. I would never put my son in a situation where I would purposefully put him like in a maze where it's you need to have an IQ of 180 to figure it out,
yeah,
because that would be such a contradiction to my love as a father, who wants who wants I don't want to just make it so simple for him so that he doesn't have any challenge. I want his will to come after me, right? But to make it the kind of maze like Rubik's cube phenomena that some of the folks end up experiencing in this whole true church um,
right.
investigation, they can lose sight of the cross, and so the cross becomes minimized to a thumbs up. But
Mm.
the real love comes when you could figure out whether Photius was right or Mark of Ephesus was right. Then the love of God comes pouring out. Come on, give me a break.
It really seems to be a strong. I mean, both in like the Sedevacantist and in the true Orthodox or the hyperdox worlds of it's like the Pharisees, where Jesus says, do what they teach. It's not that they're necessarily teaching against the tradition or against the canons or anything like that, but it's the way, it's what they're doing. It's they lean in on this, oh well, narrow is the gate, right? And it's like, okay, but it can't be so narrow that it's impossible. Like,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. I mean, Jesus
yeah,
said, he also said, everything about the narrow gate, how few can be saved. Yeah, he said all those things, but then he also said, "Come to me, all ye who are
mm,
weary and heavy laden, um, and I will give you rest. For my burden is light and my yoke is easy." So you don't want to tarnish. You don't want to highlight one thing that our Lord said to the detriment of something else that he said. Um, so you got to have a balanced view of these things, and I mean, Christ was willing to look at a centurion who wasn't even an Israelite and tell
yeah,
him that there was more faith in him than all of the house of Israel. you know so I know people who are not Catholic or Orthodox, but they'll just never learn Latin to figure out if the formula of Hormisdas taught papal infallibility. They're just not going to do it.
yeah. They're probably better off for it too.
Yeah.
Like,
um, but they have more faith than I've ever seen in other people,
yeah,
and who are assembled in the Orthodox or the Catholic continuum. There are
that's how I feel
just,
about my wife.
yeah.
She couldn't care less about any of this stuff. Yet it's like she always knows. She always has like this intuitive answer, and she's just a woman of prayer and service and devotion.
Mm,
And I'm like, why don't you care? And she goes, why don't you have any peace?
right.
So
Yeah, it seems like, um in the early missions where Paul was around, you had Christian divisions, right? So obviously the apostles didn't think divisions were good, you know.
right,
But at the same time, a lot of those divisions were usually led by, you know, some sort of figure who was an outlier. I have a feeling that if the apostles were here today and they saw, like, the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and like the Protestant churches, the evangelical world, um, I have a feeling that they, before they came in and said this is the right one, I have a feeling, and let it be known, I said feeling. So I'm not trying to teach
mm.
anything here. This is my hunch. I have a feeling that they would need a couple of years to figure out what to say to all of it.
That's an
You know,
interesting point. Because a lot of people will ask that, say like, oh, drop the Apostle Paul in a contemporary Novus Ordo parish or a divine liturgy at a Eastern Orthodox church, and which do you think they're going to choose? Well, I think that presupposes that they're going to make a decision immediately and not patiently be a part of that community and get to know the individuals and the people and the hearts and the spiritual lives.
yeah,
That's a good point.
yeah. I don't. That was the other thing. I ended up befriending a Russian Orthodox priest. He was American, by the way. Um, and I don't think he'd mind me saying this, but he uh do you I don't know if you saw recently, Father Joshua Shuping. He was
Yeah.
an Orthodox priest who eventually, well, when he was in Rocor as a priest, um I lived very close to him, and so we would go on long walks together, and he wasn't forcing me to be Orthodox. I wasn't forcing him to be Catholic, but we kind of knew that that's we believe differently about a lot of things, so we kind of forced our conversations to be about other things that we agreed about. um and occasionally he said, Eric, I think you'd make a really good deacon in the Orthodox Church, just quipping. Um, but eventually he started to realize that he was driving an hour away to be a priest at this Catholic chapel. They had to rent the place from the Catholic Church, and there was one Slavic family there, and he wanted to preach the gospel. He wanted to go out and, and he was kind of restricted to that. And he had some stories about the Orthodox experience, and not not everything that you would hear right on like the Orthodox presentations of coming into the real Orthodox Church. I mean, you have Orthodox will say, we're not saying that, you're gonna that everything's scandal free in the Orthodox Church, but you've got the liturgy, you've got the tradition, you've got the councils, you've got the asceticism, the fasting, you got all these things, so you can make use of it if you want to do it on your own. Um, but there's just some things that he had said that by the time he started to wonder about Eastern Orthodoxy, um, I also learned enough to tell myself that there's so much about the Catholic and Orthodox divide that makes it a tough decision, and maybe if I was Eastern Orthodox from the big get go, right? Because I entered the Catholic Church, so I ended up
Right.
experiencing all these things as a Catholic. But if it was the reverse and I was an Orthodox, um, I can't really say that I would have left by now. I probably
That's
might be just like I am now. And in the book here, I try to be objective as much as I can. Of course, you're going to see things in there where I kind of, put my 2 cents in for why I think the Catholic side is to be considered. But I don't really come in full force until the end. And even there, I kind of show that the Orthodox objections are significant. They're
yeah.
significant. And, so I wish I had better answers. Right now, you can kind of think of me as somebody who I think I've studied enough to be happy with my decision as a Catholic.
Yeah.
Um, and with that comes my obligation to adhere to what we teach about the Catholic and the Orthodox divide, which obviously comes with some sharpness if we have to talk about it. But I, I, like I've displayed in my conversation so far, um, real people are involved in this, and I think God judges real people, not theoretical people. Not we're not
Yeah.
talking to Mark of Ephesus versus Pope Eugene the Fourth here. We're talking about people who have nothing in their mind, but they want to be in the middle of God's will. And they've not harmed anybody. They've not choked anybody to death. There's no money involved. there's no, there's
Yeah.
no political scandal. There's nothing. We just want to be in the middle of God's will. We want the light of his will to brighten the path of where our feet go. And for that, anybody who gives in 100% sincerity, and they have my respect. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems the more that I read and the more that I study, at the beginning, it seemed like everything was so clear cut. When I started looking at these two things, and I would listen to some of the common Orthodox objections, and I'm saying this as an Orthodox Christian, where it's like, well, look, they use unleavened bread, and look, oh, they make the sign of the cross this way. Oh, and it's like, man, they're right. They changed. But then I get far enough back to a time when like we're still in communion with the Armenians. They've never used leavened bread. And it's like
Right.
we didn't have a problem with it then. Or the Copts, I'm pretty sure, unless I'm mistaken, have always made the cross the other
Hmm.
way.
Hmm.
And so all the things that seem to be set up to differentiate us versus them start to melt away the further back that you get. And it's like time after time after time, I can say it's not that simple. It's way more complicated than that. And yeah, it's almost as though, well, I'll pause there and see if you have anything.
Yeah, I think it's similar. You mentioned something about icons, right, with the Coptic Church. Dr. Gavin Ortland. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but a
Yeah.
he's a Protestant theologian. Really, he's a doctor in theology. So him and I have struck a friendship in the past year, and for him, this issue of iconography is a big issue. Like, it's his reason, one of his biggest reasons for why he can't be Catholic or Orthodox. And so the Catholics and the Orthodox right now, they kind of have their backs against the wall a little bit in this debate,
Hmm.
because all the Catholic and Orthodox scholars out there, so we're talking about scholars, historians, archaeologists who are Catholic and Orthodox parishioners, are found admitting that the primitive church, you know they may have had art, but it was not as ritualistic or dogmatic as it became. And so we're trying to figure out how to respond to Dr. Gavin. I think I've you know done some reading in this to feel that, yeah, I think there's some good answers to Dr. Gavin, but at the same time, what has come out from this is you get the sense that some of the Orthodox apologists and Catholic apologists thought that the apostles immediately, like, were painting and drawing and having people, like, hiring people to do these things specifically
Yeah.
for veneration. And it's like the early evidence doesn't really prove that. They could have done that, but there's not a lot of evidence that they did. Um, and so, and for some people, it's like they from Pentecost forward, if they did
Yeah.
not produce icons for veneration as a universal Christian tradition, then I'm not going to be Orthodox anymore. And I thought to myself, wow, like, if they're that stringent on this, they're probably that way about other things. Like, they think
Yeah.
everything.
It's highly problematic.
Yeah. And so that it gets to the point where, if you're really honest, you're going to start going to sleep with sweaty palms,
Hmm.
because how far can you go with this ideological imagination? you know
It's interesting. I was having a conversation with the priest that catechized me the other day, and we were talking about that Dr. Ortland's video, and I didn't know this, and increasingly, like, as the more time goes on, I come to find that everything that I've thought was normal orthodoxy turns out to just be like Russian custom. Um, because I was catechized in an OCA, very very Russian parish, and like now I'm in a Serbian parish, and I'm like, what do you
oh,
mean you
okay.
don't bless? I'm like, what do you mean you don't bless flowers on the Dormition of the Mother of God? What do you mean you don't bless honey and things like that? But he was saying that the way that we understand venerating icons in modern Russian theological tradition practice is like super new. It's super contemporary, like possibly even like late 1800s. He's like, to walk into the church and go to the tetrapod and venerate that icon, and then go over to the icon of Christ and venerate that, and then the Mother of God, and then, all of these ones. He said most like Russian old believers, they venerate icons like once a year on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and the rest of the time they keep candle stands around them so you can't even access them. So it's like,
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I
yeah.
I in my own studies on the matter, especially in the West, um like the time of St. Gregory the Great or St. Gregory of Tours, and some of these guys, they're heroes in classical Orthodox patrimony.
Mhm.
A lot of Orthodox today that I come across, sometimes they can be, you meet, sometimes you meet them, and it's like they've got a new long Russian name, and that's the name for everything. They put it on their backpack, they put it everywhere, and
Right.
on their books. You no longer see Andrew, you see, you know the whatever, Seraphim or whatever, and then it's they.
Which is my baptismal name.
Yeah, oh, there you go. Well, then, and I'm not trying to make fun of this, okay? There's
No,
a
I know.
there's a
Yeah.
there's a there's a there's an educational point that I'm trying to make here. They start to grow. Their clothing starts to change, and they start to read Saint Basil, Saint like the Cappadocians, Saint Maximus, um, Saint John of Damascus. Like their library are all these Eastern fathers. The pillars all the way up to
Yeah.
Palamas, and the Losky, Florovsky, always. But if you go further back, like if you read Gregory Palamas, if you read Maximus, if you read John of Damascus, they think that the fathers of the West are just as important as the fathers
Yeah.
of the East. And, in my research during the time of St. Gregory the Great, the Gregorian papacy, he's talking about religious artwork being there for aesthetic contemplation, but it shouldn't be everywhere. And
Mhm.
if it happens to be inside of a church, they need to be careful that people don't get too obsessed with it, you know. Um, and so you don't really get the sense that what they're doing there is exactly what the later iconophiles did in
Yeah.
late Byzantium. And
Just
even
covering the churches top to bottom in
yeah,
icons.
covering the churches in top to bottom, right. And if churches had pictures, so like it seems the way they talked about it was that a lot of churches didn't have pictures. They had a lot of candles
Mm.
in the West, but they didn't have a lot of paintings necessarily. Um, and maybe that was a sight to see. They talked about going to Rome to see the beautiful baptistry, as if they don't have things like that themselves, you know.
Mm.
So it seems like there was an organic process. So it's just interesting for even Catholics and Orthodox to learn that you can't just go back to St. John of Damascus. As good as he was, he himself said that if the Latin fathers are heretics, the whole religion is false now, because they're part of our family. And if
Yeah.
you're going to cut one of them off, because they didn't adhere to some sort of ascetic discipline, or even, and this is where, the controversial issue of like Augustine comes in. Um, I find that, and I've even read guys in Orthodoxy who have said that his canon and his being saint needs to be called into question for
Yeah.
Orthodox, because he just, how many heresies did it take for Theodore of Mopsuestia, Origen, and Eutyches to be kicked out of the church? Just one, just a few
Yeah.
letters, just a few letters. So, and Augustine is found writing volumes of things that some Orthodox consider to be just rank heresy. Not just one blurb about universalism, talking about whole books, whole sermons,
Right.
um, catechetical instructions that they would have thought was wrong. But if it only took one error to condemn Theodore of Mopsuestia, 100 years after his death or whatever, then perhaps we could do the same thing with Augustine, despite the fact that it's been, so many centuries. And see, something like that, even to consider something like that, I think we're getting into that mindset again, where it's like, you know, we're getting to the point where we're making this out to be more of a joke than it is anything serious anymore.
Mm.
So, yeah. So anyway, to your point, some things are surprising to learn that are not apostolic and universal and the way things always were.
Right. And the one danger that I mean, I see how this would be kind of me. Well, I'll just say it and we'll figure out what it means in a minute. But, when and somebody were to ask me, like, what does it mean to be capital O Orthodox? And it's like I could give a lot of answers, you know, but I find that my instinct, I want to say this right. What I don't want to be found doing is having to define my orthodoxy, capital O, in relation to just the papacy.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
it's like, why are you Orthodox? Yeah, we don't have a pope. Like, that shouldn't be a
Right.
sufficient answer. And I'm not saying that is the only answer. I think there are good answers to that question. But it also can't be, oh, well, we use leavened bread. Oh, our priests have beards. Oh, think married clergy, like things like that,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, you don't want that. You want to have something that is rooted in the past, rooted in, you want to be able to enjoy it for its own standing. Because if it doesn't have its own 2 feet to stand on, and it can only stand when it leans on other things,
Yeah.
then it becomes more artificial than
Yeah.
essential.
And back to a point you made earlier, like, the person that you said is, oh, when I'm in the divine liturgy and I'm chanting and it's all going on, I'm at peace. I don't need to question all that stuff. I definitely experienced that myself. Like, I have 1,000 questions. That's why I'm talking to you. That's why I continue to research and continue to read. I'm not content to turn that off. A lot of people I know that have either become Orthodox or Catholic seem to immediately just shut all the books and move on. And maybe I'm jealous of them. I don't know, but it just doesn't seem like that's the prudent thing to do. But I do agree that when I'm in the liturgy, I don't have a care in the world. When we sing the cherubic hymn and cast aside all earthly cares, and then I
Yeah.
receive Holy Communion, like, I'm not worried about any of this stuff. I do have peace, but it's the other 6.5 days a week where I'm just like voraciously going through this thing, trying to figure it out.
Yeah, it's and sometimes what happens for me, and I got to be careful because you know if I say this to my wife, for example, I could potentially you know harm some people by saying this, that sometimes you can question the goodness of God in all of it, because um,
Mm.
you know going back to that father analogy, Jesus himself said that you know when your children ask you for something, to get to like a gift, do you give them a
Yeah.
rock? Do you give them a rock? And you're like, no, a rock, or no, you give them bread, you give them good things, right? He said, well, his argument is, well, if you being evil, because we're all evil, if you being evil would never give your son a rock over bread, you know, um, then how much more is God the Father, who is not evil, he's good, going to give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him?
Mm.
And it could be very frustrating because that's a beautiful verse and all, but for some of these people who are caught up in the matrix of orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, Catholicism, they feel like all they're getting in their cup is sand and rock, because
Yeah. Amen,
they're
man.
s- they're they're confused. They don't know where they should be. Um, and so this whole thing of, well, I'm asking for the Holy Spirit. I've been on my knees. I was on my knees in 2005. I was earnestly seeking the truth in 2007, and I was at a Baptist church. So that can be very confusing, and it could, if somebody doesn't know how to deal with that, they can potentially walk away. And I've seen people do that. They walk away. I've seen people walk away from the faith because of that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about, obviously, this isn't a surprise that now we have literally unlimited access to the entire patristic treasure trove and 1,001 pop apologists for every denomination possible, and everybody's an expert, and we could listen to them all in one day and have these conversations. And it seems, I don't know if it's always been this way, where you have like all of these passing ships of somebody, Protestant becomes Catholic, Catholic becomes Orthodox, Orthodox becomes Muslim, Muslim becomes Protestant pastor, all these reaction videos and things like that. Do you think that that's a recent phenomenon, or it's something that's always been there? Or do you think potentially this is headed in a far more dangerous direction where people are just going to apostatize because they're so defeated?
Yeah. So, before a certain time, lay people just didn't have access to sources. When I read books from like the 1800s, there's one particular guy that he wrote a book. In fact, everybody knows John Henry Newman, right? Well,
Hmm.
John Henry Newman, he was an Anglican, so he was dealing with the Protestant movement, the Oxford movement in the Church of England. um, and so, to be deep in history is to cease to being is to cease being Protestant. And for a guy like myself, one of the things that I feel like Newman just overlooked was the Eastern Orthodox claims. He just
Hmm.
didn't seem to deal with it, right? Well, there's a guy out there just like Newman, probably just as smart as Newman. His name was Frederick Joseph Kinsman. He was also a Church of England minister, and he had a Newman journey, just like Newman, but it was Anglican versus Orthodox.
Yeah.
And so I read his biography, which is basically his journey studying the matter, and things that he could have learned today in like 2 weeks, it took him 40 years to learn, because he
Mm.
had to travel to Chalcedon to read certain texts, translate it there, confirm translations. He had to go to Rome to get things from the archives and things like that. Today, it's all online. It's in,
Yeah.
some of it's hidden in very expensive books, but a lot of it's in books now. So today you have more of, uh, curiosity is just as high as it's always been, but the way to satisfy it has just grown exponentially. And so I think it's more of a recent thing, you
Yeah.
know, than it was in former days, for sure. And I think if you get somebody who has a personality quirk, like they're perfectionist, they've got some sort of compulsive disorder with, maybe what they got was wrong, and they're so used to they're they're used to trying really hard, thinking they did really well, but then they get a 74 on the test. Like, people who have these issues, they might spend the rest of their life literally studying these things. Um, and I gotta say, I was that way. And I
I'm
can
that
say,
way.
yeah, I can say now that I've been tamed. Thank the Lord. Um, but it used to be where I was writing paragraphs in Greek or in English, and then having it translated into Greek so I could send an email to a professor in Thessaloniki to confirm this was said and at this time. Uh, French, French scholars, whatever you name it, I was trying to do my best to make sure that I was in the truth. Um, but now, I just, if God, if God Himself is not going to be clear, then that means that my responsibilities are not going to be held to the fire of something more clear. You know,
Yeah. That's a really good point. Say that one more time. If God Himself is not going to be clear,
yeah. So,
then
like,
your responsibilities.
there's a sense in which we are responsible for our own blindness, right?
Mm.
The Pharisees were blind, and Christ accused them for it, right? So they couldn't appeal to ignorance, but so what you do is, okay, am I in sin? Because if I'm in
Mhm.
sin, then, a clear sin, not like one of these things where you're also going to be scrupulous, and maybe you sin by looking too long at some woman's hair at the store or something. No, I'm talking about like verifiable, sins. Well, yeah, then God's not going to reveal truth to you. If you're doing something that's wrong, then that could be the reason why you're you know being misled. But if you're purifying yourself, um, you are um, you're doing all the the basics of New Testament spirituality, putting the
Yeah.
next person above you, putting on other person's needs above yours, going the extra mile, praying for your enemies. Um, you're taking care of your family, right? Because Paul says if you can't take care of your own family, you're worse than an unbeliever. If you're giving to the church, if you are praying, you saying your prayers, you're asking the Lord for wisdom, guidance, like Proverbs says. Proverbs says wisdom is out there in the streets. All you got to do is just ask. Knock
Yeah.
and you shall receive. And asking you shall receive, knock and it'll be open to you. All of these things are given to those who are pure in heart, like the Psalms say. um, then then I think that you have good grounds to say that God is, if he's not going to make anything abundantly clear, then you're responsible for protecting what what your eyes can see. That doesn't get rid of the it doesn't get rid of the responsibility to study these things out. So if you are Orthodox, or if you are Catholic, or if you are Protestant, um, try to find the best resources you can and start going through them slowly and carefully. Not in one day, not in one week. It's just not going to happen. And here's where I the balance comes in for me, because I'm not just telling people to just say pray and be holy and everything's cool. No, we've got some divisions here. The Lord's will is for the church to be one and undivided. And we have divisions according to faith. We have the divisions according to morals. We have divisions according to a number of things. Well, look into these things. Look into them. Find the holiest people, the best scholarship, with the best intentions. So that means that if you're reading a book and then all of a sudden they're cursing out cursing people out in the first chapter, well, yeah, then I probably shouldn't find uh this
Yeah.
person is disqualified. But you find qualified people in your life who are of well repute. If they're parents, they're holy parents. If they're priests, they're holy priests. And take your time to study these things out and document your journey, document what you're learning. um and uh and don't sweat it. Don't break a sweat. Just don't break a
Mm.
sweat, because along the way you're doing everything that God is showing you. So your responsibility can only be to the degree or the proportion that God is revealing things to you. And and I know that sounds kind of subjective, but all of us have to face that. All of
Yeah.
us has to face that. You can't just say, well, listen to me because I'm the Anglican rector of the APA on the Northeast coast.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, well, thank you, Pastor, but I really feel that I need to study, this issue out, and I need the space to do it. Well, I'm not giving you the right to do that. As well, you know now that could come into some you can come into some conflict with spiritual directors. But you know and that's another thing. Some spiritual directors can be they force you in to things, and
Yeah.
can be abusive. I've had spiritual directors from Baptist to everywhere in between, and all of them would have condemned each other. So
Right.
so you can get caught up in the mix of all that. You can afford yourself a better education if you study more, if and you do it with an open mind. See, with me, like when I sit down with my Coptic friends, I have a few. I have one particular that really wants to see me become Coptic. um, I listen to everything he says. I think about it in the shower, while I'm driving. I'll take notes when I can, when I'm free. But if nothing moves the needle for me, then nothing moves the needle for me,
Yeah.
and that's it.
Yeah. That man, that kind of brings me back. I told you before we even started that I had like a handful of questions and
Oh yeah,
topics
on
relating to like
development and all that. Yeah,
Oriental. Or we probably won't get into that. I definitely want to respect your time, and I'm sure we could possibly, if you're up for it,
I
a
have to. Yeah,
future conversation.
I have to go at, I would say, 2:58 because I actually have another show at 3, so I'm good
Okay.
till 2:58.
Well, we'll start winding down because I have something at 3 too, and it'll take me a little longer to get there. But I see we only have a few people watching, but I want to give them an opportunity too if they have any questions to type them out while we chat. And then also I want to make sure that when we do get off of here, will you send me links to your blog, your book, your YouTube channel, things like that? I want to make
Yeah,
sure I make those available.
certainly.
Um, but yeah, so if anybody has any questions, we'll let them type them. But one thing that you had said to me when we were texting that I thought was just really, really good. You said it's kind of like a hotel, right? And there's a
Mhm.
lobby, and if you go into the lobby, you have these different doors. One might be Roman Catholic, one might be Eastern Orthodox. And you said depending on what you focus on, you could go through any one of those doors. So could you speak to that a little bit, or maybe talk about what things would pull you in one of those doors, or
Yeah, absolutely.
something
Yeah,
to that?
yeah. So a lot of it also depends on the level of education we have, which our Lord is conscious of. To those who know more, the more stripes they'll be given if they don't pay heed to what they know. But I find that when somebody only goes into one room and they give all their energy to defending their decision to go into that one room, um, but they haven't opened their mind to studying what's in the other rooms, you can you lose the chance, to see what's around you. Um, but what I have found is that I know that inside the room of Roman Catholicism, there are things in there. There's more doors within the main door, more rooms within the front door. Where if I go into there, I know if I dwell upon one thing for long enough, that I will develop a reaction in my heart that will want me to
Mm-hmm.
go out the front door, and
Mm-hmm.
go into another door. And I've afforded myself the opportunity, like I told you, by going to Orthodox services and trying to be a catechumen, that being in the Orthodox Church, I realized that there are things that I can also see and dwell upon inside the room of Eastern Orthodoxy. That if I dwell on it, the sheer fact that I can't solve it and I'm going to have to deal with that while I'm there also makes me want to go out the front door of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Um, and But you got to pick one. You got to pick one door. I got that from C.S. Lewis, right? Because he talks about going into the door. You've got all these different denominations, and history goes in many different directions. And if you're from Ethiopia, well, what do you know? You're probably going to be Ethiopian Orthodox.
Yeah.
If you're seeking, and you're going to have to pick one. And once you've picked one, you've got to recognize that not everything's going to be satisfying. There's going to be a
Yeah.
number of things that are not going to be satisfying, and you've got to be okay with not being able to have an answer for everything.
Mm-hmm.
Like right now, I get Orthodox asking me all the time, your church allows the Byzantine Orthodox to venerate Palamas and Mark of Ephesus and even Nestorius in some cases and things like that. How can that be? I'm really not happy with the answers we have.
Yeah.
I'm really not happy with it. Not because I have anything against those guys, but because it seems to be a little inconsistent.
Mhm.
Forget about the persons, Palamas and all those men. I mean, I would, you know, I'd be ecstatic to meet them. But just on an intellectual level, things seem to be very inconsistent. I don't have a really good answer to that question. So potentially, if an Orthodox person wanted to torture me with a matter that I really can't answer and make me look kind of stupid, all they need to do is pack in that ammunition container with things like that and just keep shooting at me.
Mm.
Um, but I know enough to realize that as an Orthodox, that um, a good historically minded Catholic can wrap my knuckles about something else that
Mhm.
as an Orthodox, I don't think I have an answer for. And so I have a closet in the room for those unanswered issues, um, and the, I have to wait for the Lord. If He's going to
Yeah.
give me an answer to that one day, then He will. It's kind of like when the Israelites were brought to the foot of the Red Sea. Lord, we came this way. This is the way Moses led us. You know, we turn around. We've got the Egyptians. We're gonna die. Well, then that's when the Lord gave the way to open up the waters. Well, it
Yeah.
that didn't come because they all expected it to come, right? So it was a problem that they had to deal with for whatever time before the water opened up. So I just consider it like that. When God wants to open up the Red Sea on these unanswerable difficulties that I have, then He will, because He'll
Mm.
know that I need to have it opened up to me. You know, but until then, I'll let the problem rest,
Yeah.
and I won't have it affect my pulse anymore. Um, and I think you're going to have that as in all the other Christian options. If you're a Mormon, you want to go Mormon, I think you're going to have a lot of it. I think you're going to have a lot of
Yeah.
it. As a Jehovah's Witness, I think you're going to have a lot of it. A Protestant, obviously, is going to be much easier. You're going to have more continuity with the past, basic Judeo-Christian message and stuff like that. But as soon as you start to study, things a little bit more, study New Testament more deeper, you start to realize, well, maybe we are doing something new that was not really built upon the foundations of our fathers and ancestors in the Christian faith. You know,
Yeah.
in which case, if God's showing you that, then I bid you well journey. But yeah, so I think that's. I mean, there's so much to go with this analogy about hotels and rooms, but
Yeah. Well, I think maybe one day we can dedicate a whole time to just talking about that
yeah,
and just see what happens. But um, yeah, man, I really appreciate this more than you can know, and I have seriously the utmost respect for the work that you do, and I count you as a brother and a friend, and yeah, I
likewise.
thank
I
you.
I really appreciate you having me on here, and one thing I have to say is that sometimes people are wanting something more firm and like, okay, do I take this pill or that pill to get
Right.
saved? And I think that I wish I could be that clear, um, but you know when you are a Christian anywhere, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, whatever, you learn very quickly that the Lord doesn't work that way. Even with
Yeah.
demon possession, right? He even said that in some cases, it's going to take fasting and prayer, right? Well, if there are strongholds like that God doesn't answer, even though He could, unless you're fasting and praying without anxiety. Well, I think there's strongholds in what we're all talking about here that we've been talking about.
Mm.
that takes fasting, prayer, but also no anxiety. Because if you have anxiety, then you're questioning, you're doubting God, and that's what I want to call people away from, is doubting the goodness of God.
Yeah. Well, amen to that, man.
Thank you.
Well, cool. Thank everybody who's watching now and everybody who will watch this ever. And we'll see what happens. And I'm sure we'll make it happen again soon. But with that, I'll go ahead and call it quits. I guess I'm supposed to say all that nonsense about like liking and subscribing. Do what you want. You don't have to do it. I don't care. But
That's awesome.
all right. The end.
Bye bye.